Welcome to today's session on shifts in the UK academic job market. This is run by the Career Service, particularly for researchers that includes PhD students and postdocs. There's always been fluidity in the academic job market, but in the past few years, there have been some significant shifts, which is what we wanted to focus on today. We've chosen to focus particularly on two areas of interest that perhaps you haven't heard of before, or perhaps you've heard of them and you don't necessarily know what they mean. And in order to do that, we've called in two experts from the university. We have Liz Simmonds, who's the head of the Action Committee on Research Culture, to talk about her role in research culture at Cambridge, which broadly encompasses the attitudes, expectations, and norms of research communities. And we also have Dr. Steve Joy, who's head of the Postdoc Academy, to talk about the concept of porosity in academia, meaning how easy it is to move back and forth between academia and industry and other outside organizations. So thank you, first of all, to both of you for joining us today. Both Liz and Steve will be giving a 15-minute overview of these two areas of interest before opening the floor to questions for the remaining 30 minutes. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Liz.
Thanks, Sonali. Do you want to take your slides down and then I can line up? Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you. As Sonali said, I'm the university's head of research culture. Let me just get my slides running. So this is a print in the university. I've been doing it for about 18 months now. And what I'm going to talk about this morning is a little bit about the wider research culture agenda, how it's evolving at the moment, and linking it to what it means for an academic career, if that's what you are thinking about pursuing longer term at the moment. So if we just move on, I thought we'd start by actually thinking about what research culture means. So I don't know how many of you have come across conversations around research culture. I would imagine quite a few of you probably have heard the term being talked about because it's becoming more and more prevalent in the academic environment. And I think one of the things which is very interesting about research culture is that we don't actually really have a shared definition or even really a concrete shared understanding of what we mean by research culture. And I think what that means is that people are approaching it in lots of different ways. It means different things to different people, which can be helpful, but can also mean that people perhaps can worm out of doing things that are the important aspects of research culture.
Non si sente assolutamente niente.
Sorry, I thought there was just a bit of a disturbance there. I think that it does mean that as universities at the moment, we don't necessarily have a clear idea of strategically for the UK what we should be focusing on. But putting all that aside, even if you haven't come across the term before, I imagine that if we say the words research culture to you, you probably have a sense of what that means to you, because I think that's one of the things that I find particularly helpful about working in this space, is that people seem to really relate to the agenda regardless. And really, research culture is a little bit like organizational culture. It's not about what we're doing in the research environment, it's about how we're doing it and the environment we're creating in which research happens. So what I put on this slide in orange is actually the Royal Society's official definition of research culture. The Royal Society have been one of the driving forces in really making this a prominent discussion in the sector. And they held an event back in 2018, which really kicked off a lot of the work that we're now thinking about. And they describe research culture as the environment in which research happens, which includes norms in behaviour, expectations, attitudes, and values of our research communities. Those are a lot of very words which maybe don't mean an awful lot. So actually what I tried to do was think about in practice, what are we talking about? You know, when we're in the academic space, what do we really mean when we're talking about research culture? So I've just put a few points here about my interpretation of things that are important. So it's very much about how we work with the people around us. So that includes the people we manage and mentor, as well as the people who manage and mentor us. How we value the different contributions that people bring to the research endeavour. That's a very interesting and wide conversation in this space. How we reward and recognise individuals for the contributions they make. There's a very strong link to the EDI agenda. In fact, sometimes research culture can be conflated a little bit with the EDI agenda, but culture is all about creating safe and inclusive work environments. And also one of the other kind of big agendas that sits in the research culture umbrella is open research, and that's an agenda that I would imagine many of you have had an opportunity to think about and perhaps discuss as well. So it's a pretty broad term, and one of the things that I say it means that people can perhaps wriggle out of some of the things they don't want to think about, but also means that sometimes everything gets chucked in the research culture basket. And why this is important to you will become apparent as we go through the presentation. So enjoy this little video of a goldfish. I was really trying to find an image that represented to me what I think the situation is that you guys are in that you are both affected by the research culture, but you are also influencing the research culture yourselves. And so it's not something that a little bit perhaps like other aspects of what we might talk about today, it's not something that can happen independently of you. You are in that culture, you are working in that space, and you will all be having different experiences of that. But also as you progress through an academic career, if that's what you decide that you want to do, you will increasingly influence that culture yourself. And I think that's why I was trying to find a way of visualizing that you're kind of pushing, pulling, viewing, experiencing. And so I've tried to structure the presentation, first of all, looking at how the research culture is probably affecting you at the moment, and then thinking as you're progressing through a career in academia, what you might need to consider in terms of the influence you will have on the research culture. So at the moment, I think we're calling this research culture, but you might see a slide like this or some points like this in any kind of careers talk, which was thinking about career options. So I think at the moment, what the research culture is probably means to you is it's helping you to decide, or it's influencing how you decide whether or not you stay working in this culture in the longer term. So there are definite positive aspects of the research culture, which are almost certainly driving you to pursue an academic career. They've probably, the reason why you're coming to a session like this today, because you're thinking, yep, academia is a place I enjoy, there are lots of good things about it, I want to stay in this environment. And the kinds of things that people talk about in this space are things like the intellectual stimulation of working in research and with the colleagues in research, a collaborative environment, the opportunity of working on something that might make a difference to society, to the contribution of knowledge. And there are very specific aspects of academia that probably mean that that's something which is attractive to you. And I have always been struck by how people are willing to put up with things on the negative side to pursue a long-term career in academia, because there are some real aspects to it that are very, very important to people. Of course, on the negative side, there are probably some things that you might already be questioning about the culture that you work in that might be causing you to question whether or not you really want to stay in this for the long term, and might even be driving you away from an academic career. And again, these are just three very high level things that I've noted. We've done lots of work exploring conversations around the negative aspects of research culture in a lot of depth, but aspects like the high levels of competition for positions, how that high level of competition manifests in poor behaviours, but also poor behaviours resulting from power dynamics and imbalances in the sector, long hours cultures, and other aspects that you will hear people talk about. And I think what's interesting is the conversation in the sector around research culture does tend to focus very, very strongly on the negative issues. So when you hear people talk about research culture, actually that's a byword for, I think, the issues in research culture. we don't often talk about the positive aspects of research culture, but I think that's important to think about. And it's important to think about as we move into the other part of my presentation, which is thinking about how you, as you move your way through an academic career, become more of an influencer in this space, and therefore want to try and bring out more of those positive aspects of research culture. So what I've tried to do here is think a little bit about as you progress through your academic career and you become a group leader, a team leader, or a research leader. So I'm trying to speak to all disciplines, because I think it's important to emphasize that what we're thinking about in the university in terms of research culture is across all disciplines. And I very much acknowledge that there are specific differences between the sciences and the arts and humanities in terms of the cultures and the challenges that they encounter. But as you progress, you will find yourself in a position of leadership. And I think what it's important to think about at the moment where you are and as you're going forward is how, when you get into that position of influence, when you start to build your own team, when you start to have responsibility for other people, you need to think about how you will create a positive research culture in your own space and in your own research group. And I think it's also interesting to reflect on what future young researchers might expect of their research culture. So I have been asked a few times in panels to reflect on why research culture has become suddenly such a big agenda in the last 5 years. And I think it does, to some extent, move in line with other kind of big drives in society to not accept things just the way they are. So if you look at something like the Me Too movement, that happened almost at the same time. And I do feel like the younger researchers that are coming through will start to demand certain things about the culture that perhaps haven't been talked about yet. And so I think if you are moving into a position where you're going to be leading and managing younger researchers, that's something to think about. So what's very important, and you know, this is moving slightly away, I suppose, from culture in solid terms to thinking more about kind of general leadership. But I think if you are going to create a positive research culture in the space that you work in, you do need to factor in time to step back and reflect on what you're doing as a leader and how you're approaching things to make sure that happens. And I just put a couple of prompt questions here. Really, these are the kind of things I would get people to think about if they were thinking about research culture. So how you support the careers of people that you have professional responsibility for. So, you know, whether or not you're having conversations with people that you manage about what their aspirations are and supporting them with that and giving them opportunities to try things that are going to support them in their future aspirations. And actually, although at the moment I'm kind of phrasing this as a leader, what you might do with people you manage, of course, you might see a lot of this reflected in as somebody who's being managed at the moment, whether or not this is happening. So actually, perhaps it might give you some inspiration about what you could go and ask for. When you come to build your own team, thinking about how you as a manager recruit that team and how you support and manage them to create an inclusive environment. And then, of course, how you reward and value what everybody who's working with you does. So those are just some questions I thought would be helpful to kind of step back and reflect on what you're doing. You will have an individual responsibility as you progress through an academic career, but actually you'll probably find if you are continuing in academia over the next 5 to 10 years that you will start to have institutional responsibilities for research culture. I'm going to talk a little bit about REF here because I think that's going to be the most dominant and influential part of this conversation over the next 5 to 7 years. But any environment that you're in, you will probably start to become involved at a departmental level and an institutional level in trying to drive positive change. So REF, which is the research evaluation exercise that happens in the UK about every 7 to 8 years-ish. This is how universities in the UK are ranked and how funding is then allocated. It's a very important exercise, hugely administrative in institutions the size of Cambridge. And we're already thinking, although the next one is 2028, we're already planning how we're going to address that. And what's changed recently for the next cycle is that 25% of the allocation is in this section, which is now called People, Culture and Environment. So this has put culture, research culture, firmly in the university agenda. It's something we're going to be measured and assessed on. And so all of a sudden, this is something that everybody's going to be talking about. It's quite a big thing that will be looked at both for the whole institution, but also what they call discipline level. So individual departments and clusters of departments will also have to talk about their research culture. And of course, it's very interesting because research culture, as I said at the beginning, we don't have a shared definition of what we mean by that. It's quite a nebulous concept. There's a lot of nuance around what happens. So actually, how you measure whether anyone's doing a good job in that space is quite challenging. It looks like the assessment will be more narrative based, so case studies and examples of good practice. And the reason why this is important to think about, because if you are pursuing this career over the next 5 to 10 years, you may well be asked to provide evidence of how you are in your own space creating a good research culture for this kind of measurement. But there are also going to be some metrics, and the interesting thing is that they don't really know yet what kinds of metrics that they're going to be using to assess this. And when they do announce that, which is expected in about a year's time, that will very likely significantly affect the direction of travel for this agenda, because all of a sudden we will know what we're trying to demonstrate, and so everybody will probably start working on that. So as I said, this is going to be a very big influential agenda over the next few years, and I thought it was important to reflect on that. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of talk about the section on the grant application, which talks about research culture, because if any of you are applying for independent fellowships or pots of funding for yourself, you are almost certainly going to come across this section that asks you to talk about your contributions to creating a positive research culture. So just a few tips on this. Again, I don't think anything I say here would be drastically different to what advice lots of colleagues would give you. But the key thing is this is a very much a personal reflection piece. It is not a space where they want you to go and get some standard text from the institution about what the institutional strategy is on research culture. This is about what's important to you personally in terms of research culture. And one of the things I think is really important is thinking about what you do that's maybe different to other people, different to standard ways that people might address this question. So I've helped various people with this kind of box on a grant, and often people will talk about, oh, our department has a mentoring scheme, or our department makes sure everyone has an appraisal. And I say to them, that's great, but that's pretty standard. Everyone will be doing that. You need to really think about what you're doing that's different and makes you stand out. And I think this will be a very individual section, but also, any ways in which you contribute to institutional or sector work in this space. And there are lots of opportunities for early career researchers to really get involved with this discussion. We're really looking for people to come forward and help us and help create the institutional strategy that we're working on. And those kinds of things would be really valuable to be able to talk about in your fellowship application. So as with all applications, backing your statements up with evidence of what you've done is really important. So perhaps looking for ways now that you might engage in this agenda could be really helpful. And finally, I just wanted to have a quick word about culture beyond academia, because I would imagine that many of you are exploring careers in a variety of different areas. And although research culture is at the moment quite a higher education topic of discussion. I think that there are companies who think about this very carefully, research-based companies, and they will perhaps talk about organizational culture, but they're probably actually further ahead than we are. And so I think even if you decide to move away from academia, the idea that you'll be thinking about the environment around you and the way that you work with people and you manage people and you support people in a way that creates a positive culture. So this is not just for academic careers. This is an important agenda, whichever career you decide to pursue. That's everything from me.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. We will turn it over to Steve now, who will talk to us about the concept of porosity.
Thanks very much. Let me just share my slides. Okay, so I wanted to tackle this by thinking about, I suppose, the place of academia within the wider research and innovation ecosystem in the UK. And therefore, you know, what we mean by porosity is often what I've put here, kind of mobility, connectivity, permeability. So between parts of that bigger R&I ecosystem. So I wanted to start by looking at it at the kind of macro level, at the national level, like what is it, how does the government view the place of academic research within that bigger context? How then does that filter through different kind of strategic initiatives that have emanated from the government in recent years, to how then that impacts a body like UK Research and Innovation, which is obviously the main funder in the UK. And I also wanted to end just by commenting on a couple of independent reviews that have been published in the last year and what they're recommending, but also how the government is responding. I think it's probably quite helpful, just as a kind of caveat, to say, I'm trying to, I suppose in a way, I'm trying to give you a flavour of what I think is really happening at the moment, rather than answering the question, how do I want it to be, or how do we wish it could be? I think there could be a degree to which there's quite a lot of gap in your own minds between what's really happening and what should be happening. We could maybe have that conversation later. But the other thing as well is I've kept this to quite a kind of high level presentation, because I was hoping we could use the Q&A to answer the actual crucial bit, which is, and so what now? What does this mean to you? What can you do about it? So those are my two kind of health warnings before I start. I wanted to start by showing you this image. I know you can't read the text on it, actually you don't need to be able to, but this was published by the government a couple of years ago, and it was their way of visualizing research and development investment in the UK. And this helps, I think, just as a way of kind of indicating where they see academia sitting within that bigger picture. Would you believe me if I told you I picked this diagram because it was actually an easier one to read than some of the others? So that is already telling you something about how complicated the R&I ecosystem is. But if you look on the left-hand side of the image, there's a light green band. That's charity and philanthropy. So that's the kind of slice of R&D investment which comes through the charitable sector. The big orange blocks, that is private investment. That's business and foreign direct investment in research and development in the UK. Then you've got at the top, towards the right-hand side, those dark green boxes. Those are government departments which have R&D budgets. And then the black boxes beneath it, that's specific kind of ring-fenced policy areas for R&D investment. So what this is showing is all these different stakeholders, how much money they're investing, how big their budget is, that's how big their box is, and also then how it filters down into the organisations that are really doing research. So that's where the red comes in. All of that government investment tends to come into a few key bodies, such as UK Research and Innovation, so UKRI. So if any of you are Research Council funded, that money comes from them. But UKRI encompasses Innovate UK and Research England, as well as the funding councils. So it's meant to take a more holistic view of research funding than just purely feeding into academia. But you see all those boxes at the top, then we cross that line, and then the second set of boxes below, that's where the actual investment ends up. So again, we've got charities, businesses, higher education institutions, and then that red box are what they call public sector research organisations. So there are about 50 of those in the UK that receive direct subsidy through the taxpayer. And those are places where you can carry on a research career. Some of them are more academic than others. But basically what I wanted to show you there is when the government is thinking about research funding and research and innovation in the UK, they're often seeing academia as only one component, and indeed not even the largest component of the R&D ecosystem or the R&I ecosystem. One of the things you'll notice while I'm talking is, Liz mentioned already, we don't have a good shared definition of research culture. The government can't make up their mind from one week to the next whether they want to talk about R&D, R&I, RDI. The language changes a lot. So we have to be kind of alert, I think, to the fact that there's a bit of a cacophony coming out of the government. But I think the key thing to take from this is that when we're talking about mobility and kind of porosity within the sector, the government, when they're thinking about UK research and innovation, is thinking of it in a much broader sense than primarily universities. We could also say, I think, recent administrations appear to have had a degree of skepticism about the role of universities in contributing to the R&I ecosystem, i.e. that they feel like we don't do enough or we don't commercialize enough. Just to give you an example of how one kind of real world implication of this thinking, one of the biggest funding schemes in the UK at the moment is the Future Leaders Fellows scheme that UKRI runs, which I have had some involvement in. The FLF scheme is distinctive because the work has to be interdisciplinary and intersectoral. So the research that's being funded couldn't sit within one of the normal research councils. But also the scheme is open to applicants who are in commercial, academic, public and third sector research organisations. So the funding, even though it looks on the tin, as it were, like a traditional fellowship, like one would expect to see in a university, actually there's quite a lot of diversity in where the funding goes. And in recent rounds, it's been creeping up to sort of 15, 16, 17% of the FLFs are actually in businesses, and an increasing number are in charities and public sector research organisations. So you can see some subtle shifts in the way that the funding landscape is changing because of this idea that the government is really fixated on wanting academic research to be part of this connected ecosystem. A lot of it is framed in this rhetoric about science superpower. You hear that all the time. They appear to have no concept of where the arts and humanities might fit into any of this. That's a conversation we could come back to. But there was a paper in 2021 under the heading Build Back Better, where the government reiterated its commitment to 2.4% of GDP being annually invested in R&D. When that figure was first bandied around, I think there was an expectation that there would be like a big increase in the amount of funding that goes to universities. Actually, over time, it's become much clearer that the government is seeing it as a mix of public and private funding. And in fact, only last week, they published a response to something called the Nurse Review, which we'll talk about in a moment. And they were saying that the government will directly invest 20 billion per annum. I know that it's interesting that they've now put a number on it rather than seeing it as a percentage of GDP. I'm not quite sure why that is. But the whole point is that they want to see that for every pound of public investment, there are 2 pounds of private investment. And they're much clearer now that where they are investing, they want to see it significantly focus on innovation and application. So they are really interested in commercialization. So although the government is committed to this vision of us being a science superpower, it's not the case that there's necessarily a big uptick of money flowing into universities for blue skies research or traditional kinds of scholarship. And I think that tension, that really what the government wants is return on investment for the money that comes through UKRI. We're seeing that play out more and more. Just a few other kind of, as it were, manifestations of this thinking at this macro level. In 2021, the government published an innovation strategy. And in it, this is one of the places where they were very explicit, where they said, we want to make it as easy as possible to move between academia and industry, to enable cross-pollination and expertise. And they want to support cross-sector training programs. Just as a note, when they talk about training programs, they're very often meaning PhD programs. they often, if you find training when they're talking about R&D, they often mean early career and particularly doctoral programs. And they want to encourage more movement and collaboration between academia, industry, government, and the third sector. And there's another document that was published in the same year, the R&D People and Culture Strategy. And this was framed as what they called a call to action for the sector. And they said that career paths and routes into R&D careers need to be broadened and made more stable, but barriers to mobility across the sector and disciplines need to be removed. They set out a kind of a list of what they said was the status quo and then how they'd like to see it shift. So think about careers specifically. They were talking about narrow career paths and a lack of awareness and a lack of mobility between sectors. And the outcome they want is dynamic, varied and sustainable career paths that allow movement. So what you had then in 2021 was the innovation strategy and the people and culture strategy, which are obviously interconnected, but slightly different, partly because they came from different authors and different ministers put their names on it, frankly. But what happened then was that UKRI, as the government taxpayer kind of, the body that distributes taxpayer money to support R&D in the UK, was basically tasked with responding to the innovation and the people and culture strategy. So that led to the UKRI's 5-year strategy, which launched in 2022. And they took the language of mobility and movement between sectors there, and they said that one of their 4 principles of change in the sector was going to be connectivity. So breaking down barriers, shifting the focus to diverse teams, that very much relates to the research culture agenda that Liz was talking about, but enabling the movement of people between business and academia across disciplines and sectors and between the UK and its international partners. And so UKRI is saying they still see too many silos. And that is both about interdisciplinarity, but also about intersectoral working. But crucially here as well, the criticism is that there's often seemed to be this linear one-directional relationship. So universities do the discovery and then they hand it over to businesses to turn into real-world impact, is a classic formulation, if you like, of the problem within the sector. And UKRI is setting out its mission then to say, well, actually, what we need to be doing is encouraging movement in and out, movement between, collaboration across. And I think we're at the point now where we're starting to see some of this influencing the funding calls that they're putting out there, influencing the way they put panels together to assess grant applications, and influencing the kind of documents they ask for in the application process. I've just mentioned a couple of independent reviews, which I think add to, or perhaps to be frank, complicate the picture. So Sapor Nurse did a review for the government a few years ago looking at research and development. This was published in March of this year. This is Nurse 2, basically. So it's a further independent review. The full title is Research, Development and Innovation, Organizational Landscape, an Independent Review. So this is where we get RDI as another acronym coming in. And what Nurse talked about was permeability with respect to people, ideas and skills. And interestingly, he used the word permeable or permeability 49 times in that report. So it was absolutely the kind of a centerpiece of what he was saying needs to change in the RDI landscape. So here are just a couple of quotes to illustrate what he was talking about. The landscape is hard to navigate. There is insufficient permeability between, and he calls them research performing organizations, so between RPO sectors. A lack of transparency, inclusivity, and shared understanding. Interactions between academia and industry are suboptimal. Well, I mean, we've been hearing that for years, but it's still being said. And of his 29 recommendations, recommendation 29 was career path diversity and permeability between different types of research organisation should be encouraged. Last week, the government published its response to the Nurse review. I think it's fair to say that it was met with quite a high level of underwhelm by people in the sector. Nurse was saying that what was needed in the UK is a really clear national strategy for research and development, a real sense of national priority, which then different organisations can respond to, UKRI can respond to, funding and career structures can be geared around that. And basically the government response was, thank you, this is a lovely review. Aren't we already doing many, many wonderful things? And there was a feeling that they weren't really committing to anything new or different. They reiterated a commitment to diversity in career paths, but they didn't even use the word permeability or set out any actions they will take to contribute to permeability. So interesting what one can make of that. Also published this month was another independent review on university spin-outs. So this sounds a bit niche, but obviously actually the whole concept of spinning out from discovery in universities is a key thing that the government and UKRI want to promote. So again, same thing we've been hearing through all of these reviews and these documents. It's not straightforward to move readily between academia and entrepreneurship. Leaving academia for a spin-out can be a significant risk to an academic career because routes back are limited, and publications and outputs that usually are really important in getting hired in an academic job, it's harder to keep pace with kind of producing those when you step into an entrepreneurial space. So this review had a number of recommendations, and their recommendation 11 included the suggestion that there should be an academic returner fellowship for researchers wishing to return to academia from the private sector. The government has already published its response to this review. Again, it was met warmly. They said all sorts of positive things about what they're already doing, and they kind of indicated that they thought, yes, this academic returner fellowship was a good idea, and probably they'll expect UKRI to take that forward in some way. So what was I trying to get at in all of that? That's obviously just a lot of kind of high level stuff. I am very conscious that these strategies and these reviews feel, or they often feel like they're at many stages of remove from the day-to-day on-the-ground reality. I think that's true. I think what Liz was talking about as well with research culture, that there's a recognition that change needs to come, and we're at the tipping point of a lot of that change, but there's a long way to go. I think that still feels true as well when we're talking about permeability, porosity, mobility, whatever you want to call it, that everyone can see that it is an issue. And actually these independent reviews, I think, have been much more eloquent and more granular as well about why it's an issue and what really needs to change. And I think what we're going to see in the next few years is probably subtle incremental changes in funding structures, in the kinds of outputs and career progression that are valued by different funders or by different decision makers. But we're not going to see a radical change in the next few years to, suddenly all of the academic staff in universities will be going off and working for years in spin-outs and coming back. We are a long way from that kind of level of porosity and mobility. But things do happen slowly in the R&D sector, in the higher education part of it in particular. But I do think there's this inexorable move towards promoting more mobility in and out of academia. And frankly, that is a really significant change from where we were, well, 2 decades ago, let alone 4 decades ago. So I suppose my takeaway, or what I hope you would take away from this, is a bit of a kind of watch this space. I think you are the generation that is going to start noticing these changes. And I can't tell you how they will happen and in what time frame they will happen, but I think they are going to impact your careers in ways that they haven't impacted the careers of early career researchers that have come before you, even relatively recently. So, and with that, I'm really happy to pick up further in the Q&A, but I will stop sharing my slides at that point.
Great, thank you so much, Steve, for that. Both of you, that was really insightful, and lots of things to think about, lots of shifts going on. I just want to remind you that if you want to share questions directly in the chat, you can, or you can join Slido. If you haven't used Slido before, it's quite nice because you can upvote questions that are already there. So as you're listening to the Q&A, please do check that out if that would be helpful. We'll start with our first question, which is for Liz. And it says, what is Cambridge doing to try to improve the way that postdocs are supported, recognized, and valued within the university? In a nutshell.
Okay, so I will say a little bit about the institutional work that's going on, but Steve might want to add, because as head of the Postdoc Academy, he's very specifically focused on postdocs. So the University of Cambridge has a fairly newly formed steering committee, which is putting together a a kind of forward-looking strategy for research culture. And I think one of the things that we are trying to do as a committee is focus on a smaller number of priority areas in the first instance, because as you've learned from the talks we've had so far today, research culture is big, it's complicated, and to try and tackle everything all at once isn't possible. So what we're trying to do is focus on some key areas that we know are of importance to postdocs and other people in the research environment. And we're kind of developing those at the moment, and we're looking for people to feed in, particularly in how we might take these forward. But we are very focused on really improving the space for researchers. And I think postdocs, to some extent, because of their position in the institution, maybe feel some of the effects more negatively than others, particularly people who are in more established roles. But we also acknowledge that PhD students have specific challenges, and we're thinking about those. And the 4 areas we're looking at, this will be the last thing I say on this, but just to give you a sense of the areas we're focusing on. So precarity, the negative effects of fixed term contracts. I noticed there was a question about that in Slido. We're looking at access and participation. So who gets to do research, and when people are researchers, how easy is it for them to participate in everything that's expected of them as a researcher? We're looking at how to support people who are in situations where there are challenging interpersonal dynamics or group dynamics. And we're also looking at how we support people to take the time and space that's needed to really create a positive culture. So recognizing that people are overburdened, but if we want people to really engage with this, we need to give them some time and space to do that. Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything specifically about, just because it was about postdoc reward and recognition, perhaps some of the work we've been doing on pathways.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is going to be really annoying to people on the call, because there's an element of more is coming. But actually, this year there have been a number of initiatives, and they're all grinding through the committee process at the moment, which is why you won't have heard about them yet. But so we've been looking at overhauling the whole structure of research. Researcher grades, researcher role titles, researcher promotion and progression opportunities, and that's being reviewed. In fact, Thursday by the HR committee. Hopefully there'll be a consultation in Lent term. So there's some thinking around, so the idea is the university cannot create permanent research only jobs. That is, I'm saying that is absolutely out of the question. But at least there should be opportunities for you to progress and experience kind of positive development in your career while you're here, rather than being held at this sort of particular level, which is what we've noticed. There's also work being done on looking again at the wider kind of package of benefits and support for postdocs, so including things like access to the nurseries, support with visa costs, bringing family members and dependents over. There's a lot of stuff happening. It's all in the pipeline, which I realise is just probably extremely annoying to hear, but it is true. I think the other thing more broadly that the Postdoc Academy is trying to do, and I'd be really glad if anybody got in touch and wanted to talk further about this, we want to do more to amplify the way that the postdoc voice is heard in university decision making. We do have a process through the Postdocs of Cambridge Society, which is officially recognised by the university as a senior society. We have a process to get postdocs onto senior committees in the university. So if you're signed up to the PDoc mailing list, and if you're not, please do sign up. But if you're signed up to the PDoc mailing list, you'll get those opportunities. But what we find is that actually a lot of postdocs don't want to commit to sitting on a committee, but they'd still like to find ways to contribute. So I've been doing some work with a couple of the schools, with the PDoc Society and with the HR Directorate, to think about how we can find better ways of giving postdocs the opportunity just to be heard, even if they're not having to commit to sitting on committees or formally writing papers, as it were, that kind of thing. So there's stuff happening in that space. I think one of the other things is because Cambridge is such a crazy paving kind of organization, sometimes it can be more effective to actually be having conversations at your local level, so in your department or your faculty or in your centre, about do they have a postdoc committee? If they don't have one, why couldn't they set one up? Actually are postdocs represented on committees in your faculty or department? If they're not, come and talk to us, because we can give you examples of where other departments have done that. So some of it could be, I think, some of it's about sort of the bigger kind of policy level stuff that affects everybody in the university, but also Cambridge is both kind of big and small, and that local level stuff can have a big impact as well. And we basically do work with people that want help in kind of making change happen at their local level. College membership, yeah, a lot of the colleges are increasing the kind of ranges of kind of ways of becoming associated with colleges. So some of them offer fellowships, some of them offer associateships, some of them offer like a postdoc society. It really varies. I think what I would suggest is we need to be realistic. Access to a college is access to a network, but it's not access to career development opportunities of the kind that you can't get within the university. So it's not that being in a college is going to give you access to pots of funding or access to kind of research facilities or kind of what it is a network of people. And it is incredibly valuable, and I would never discourage someone from a college membership, but there's a lot you can do to kind of to get the access to that isn't just based. And also the thing with a college membership is you only get out of it what you put in, so you have to be willing to do all of the kind of networking and all of the kind of proactive stuff to get the best out of being in a college. And I think sometimes I think it's hard from the outside looking in to understand what a college can be and what it can't be for a postdoc. And I think what we often find is people get college membership and then they don't do anything with it and say, well, that was a waste of time. Why didn't I get anything out of it? So I think we need to be really kind of clear and tactical, basically, about like what a college can be for a postdoc and what it isn't. I'm talking too much now, Sonali. I'm going to hand back to you.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thank you to Liz as well. The next question kind of focuses a bit, you've both touched on this idea of precarity, but it says a challenge in the academic system is the scarcity of permanent jobs and the lack of job security on the short-term research contracts. Do you think this will change? So very much kind of your opinion on that change.
It's a very interesting question because I think a little bit like Steve said, I'm not sure things will absolutely change, but a lot of attention is being directed at the negative effects that fixed term contracts create. And so universities don't particularly have the power to change that, and I'm not sure if funders can or want to change that, but there's certainly work happening to try and lessen the negative effects. So I think there's a move to try and encourage universities not to use really, really short fixed term contracts. So contracts less than a year in duration, and funders looking at opportunities to perhaps extend the length of the contracts and the grants that they offer to provide a little bit more security. One of the things that we wanted to try at Cambridge, we're still looking for funding to try this, is a model whereby you have pools of, we call them roving researchers, I think they're also called that in other places, where people aren't necessarily attached to projects, but they can be deployed to backfill gaps in other projects, perhaps where someone's gone on parental leave or long-term sick leave, and to kind of support people to experience the academic space in that way. That's something we'd like to try as a different model of delivery. And I think there are definitely conversations happening around, what ideas can we come up with as a sector that might mitigate these problems. In fact, I'm attending a session on Thursday this week, which is organised by Universities UK, which is looking specifically at this issue of precarity in research careers. But I'm not optimistic that there will be a really significant change along the lines of let's give lots more permanent contracts. And I think a lot of the time the conversation in this space is trying to move towards that ideal. And I think what's going to happen in the sector is much more along the lines of we're kind of stuck with this model. How do we adjust the model and support the people to make sure that we mitigate as much as possible the challenges that brings? I don't know if Steve has any other thoughts.
Yeah, I think I agree. So interestingly, the nurse review, one of the things he talked about in there was that the system should operate more on trust. That actually the way that at the moment everything is like, funding is to a person for a project, that we can't operate effectively with everything being so kind of piecemeal. That again is not something that the government picked up on in their response. They showed no indication to rethink that. I think what we are seeing is more of a move towards bigger, like longer term funding, like program grants, but it's still fixed term. And I think so we have to kind of look at it in two different ways. It's as long as the university has to competitively win the funding and bring it in, there will be fixed term contracts, because the universities cannot take on the liability of saying, well, we'll just offer permanent contracts to all those people and hope that there'll be more money down the line. It just isn't realistic. And also some of the research that's been published this year shows that despite the number of grants that are supposedly fully economic costed, universities lose quite a lot of money on quite a lot of the research that they host. It almost never really covers the cost of hosting it. So as long as we operate in a system where universities aren't given a big block grant to spend kind of in their own, according to their own best judgment, we will be tied to fixed term contracts. But as Liz says, I think there's a recognition that the actual length of funding should be longer than it has been in recent years, that too many people are on contracts that are simply too short. But I think that ultimate idea that we should be offering permanent contracts just isn't going to happen anytime soon.
Great, thank you both. The next question kind of pulls together a couple of different themes that have come through, talking about how realistic is movement between industry and academia, given the discrepancies in pay and job titles and long-term contracts. And I think kind of tangentially related to that is the changing landscape of PhDs approaching either doing a PhD part-time and working in industry, or doing internships and then kind of having that as part of their path. So two related questions.
Can I jump in on this, Liz? Because interestingly, I was looking at a review, and this was a national review, looking at post-PhD, what is the average both median and mean salary of postdocs compared to what they would get at an equivalent stage in industry. And actually, at that immediate post-PhD stage, Cambridge pays better, for example, than an equivalent job in industry. The problem is that very quickly as you progress, the salaries don't keep pace. But there is it's fundamentally not the case that at that immediate post-PhD stage, industry pays vastly better. The other thing is there are some sectors where research skills are so in demand, there's a whole other kind of market, there's a whole other job market there. So obviously stuff to do with AI, for example, people are being poached with like promises of high salaries. But that was a national kind of review. But yeah, like by the time we start talking about being a group leader or something, yeah, at that point, academia doesn't keep pace with the salary. But I was interested, at least, that at lower grades it does. In terms of like, I think the issue with the moving in and out of kind of academia and industry is that they assess for different things. And so if you're a career changer at any point in your life, you have to obviously take all the experience you've got and try to find a way to distill it and reframe it so that somebody in another sector understands it as equivalent or valuable. And I think that we don't have good understanding, I think, with people kind of in industry, that in academia, you get your jobs on the basis of your ability to bring in funding and to publish. And then in industry, they value leadership skills, for example, in a way that you often have you have very limited capacity to demonstrate in academia if you haven't led a. So I think there is this issue that we assess for different things. The hiring decisions are made on a different basis. I imagine the only way that will change is slowly, as more people move in and out, we get to a stage where there's more familiarity about what good looks like in one context and in another. But yeah, I don't know, Liz.
Yeah, I think the barriers are so much the salary. I think the barrier is you've got two different cultures, and it is to do with how people are assessed. And if people want to move out, as Steve was saying in his talk, they then stop being able to produce the outputs and the measures that they would then be measured on if they moved back into academia, and that puts people off from the idea that porosity, that you might work back and forth between the two, is at the moment very challenging. interestingly, also something that, so the Russell Group is holding a discussion next week on this topic, and I was just looking at the questions on the agenda for us, and it's all of these kinds of things that we're just discussing here about, you know, what can universities do to make it easier? How can you make it easier from a contractual point of view to give people experience in trying industry and that kind of thing? And these are very basic questions. And so I feel like we're a long way off from this being a kind of a realistic thing. We're still at the very early stages of trying to work out how to make it feasible.
Yeah, the irony is that some of the funding structures, so the funders are saying good things about wanting you to work in industry, but some of the actual terms and conditions of their grants militate against it. So as you say, Liz, it's like it's right down to kind of like basics, brass tacks kind of stuff that we're still figuring out in different cases.
Oh, well, that's the case with a lot of issues with the funders, though, that they say they want one thing, such as, you know, professional development. They want all their researchers to engage in professional development, but don't provide a mechanism through the funding that actually facilitates that. So
yeah, and often it is, you know, they're complex organizations, right, isn't it? So the people writing the policy and saying the good things about the strategy aren't the people in the legal and contracts team who write the grant. And you know that UKRI as an entity is just as big, complex and dysfunctional as Cambridge is.
More so.
lots of slow movement with these big organizations. We've only got a few more minutes, so I wanted to actually bring up what is maybe a bit more of a concrete question. If you're trying to show a lectureship selection committee you've been involved in the research culture agenda, what could you do now as a postdoc? And I guess more broadly as a PhD student or a postdoc and early career researcher, what are ways that you can get involved in kind of making proactive changes to the research culture?
Yep. Oh, lots of different ways. And I think I divide them roughly into two. So you could get involved with institutional work that's happening. So that might mean joining a committee in your department, or joining an institutional committee, or forming a kind of action group in your space. I've seen quite a few early career researchers kind of get together with people in their department and look for things to change. And so that's kind of an official way of being involved. But I think it's equally as valid and supportive of the whole culture change agenda to just think about what you personally do to work with other people, to support other people. For example, do you support or mentor anybody who's at an earlier stage in their career? And particularly if you do that, or if that's something you want to do, thinking about who you mentor, and you know, whether you can take the opportunity to support people from groups that don't normally have access to that kind of support. How you might contribute to ideas within your immediate research group or department to change the structures and the way you work, you know, how suggesting ways in which you might recognize and value people in your team. So, you know, just as a kind of small example, our team has we have on our Slack channel, we have a woohoo channel, which is where we encourage everybody to thank people publicly in the team when they've done something that's helpful, and that kind of public recognition of what your colleagues are doing. So I think there's a lot you can do personally yourself about the way you interact with people and the way you engage with culture that is just as important as being involved in kind of official committees, although that's also really important to have researcher voice in as well. And one of the things that I'd like to produce actually with the people we're working with on this strategy is a kind of a set of reflective questions almost that get you thinking about what does it mean to engage in research culture, and what practically can you actually get involved with, and that would help with those kind of sections on applications and such.
And I would add to that, also think, you know, out with the university, what about kind of disciplinary networks, professional bodies, you know, are there like ECR groups and forums and things that you could get involved in, you know, within your particular subject area? There seem to be more and more and more of those now. And then there are also, no, I'm not going to say that. What I'm going to say is thinking about a lectureship application in particular. I think sometimes it can be the case that if you don't feel like you've got masses of opportunity at the moment to do loads of research culture work, at least have a really good plan for something you'd like to do if they gave you the job, right? So think about like one of the things you could do now is research examples of really good stuff you hear about elsewhere. Like do some Googling, talk to people. When you meet people at conferences, ask them about what's happening about research culture in their institution. If you pick up a gem of a really great idea that you think a particular department could implement, then it could be just as valuable in an interview to sell them a really great idea for what you would do if they hired you. And I think sometimes once we move away from thinking specifically about your research, often lectureship panels are very interested in your ideas for where you're going, not just like that you have to have proven you've done everything. Actually, having a plan can be as good as having done it in the past, if the plan is good, convincing, and appropriate.
Excellent advice from both of you. So thank you again.
We're going to pick up with a question about the scope for moving between academia and industry. So the question said that there's more scope for this for those in the sciences, and what is the model for those in arts and humanities? And as a follow-on to that, how does teaching fit into that movement back and forth between industry? So Steve, can you start us off with that one?
Yeah, sure. I suppose this is obviously a mean thing to do, but I would slightly rephrase the question. I think when we're talking about the permeability and the connectivity across the research and innovation ecosystem, there is a bit of a tendency for us to think that we're talking about a binary system. So there's academia and industry, but actually some of those strategic documents that I was referencing and some of those moves to think about connectivity are actually about trying to see the R&I ecosystem as broader. So it would include public sector research organizations, it would include charities, it would include research done by central government devolved authorities. So if we think of the question as being specifically about academia and industry, I would agree it's a more challenging dynamic for arts and humanities researchers to think about. But if we're understanding this bigger, broader R&I ecosystem, I think you can see there are lots of places where arts, humanities, and social sciences researchers can step in. I think it comes down to the same thing it always comes down to, which is needing to be willing to do a bit of the legwork at the point of kind of investigating and applying, to ask, well, how is that research culture different? How are their projects different? What are the timeframes? How are they structured? So that you can be ready to describe your academic experience in the right kind of language that shows you've thought about that transition. But I think, yeah, one of the challenges is probably just to try to nudge all of us really out of this kind of it's academia or industry. It's actually a bigger piece than that. Do you want me to go on to the second part of the question about teaching?
Yeah, sure. And then we can get Liz's thoughts as well.
Yeah, sorry, I realize I'm talking too much.
No, that's fine.
I was just thinking about teaching. On the whole, if what we mean by teaching is standing up and delivering lectures, it's not hugely transferable unless what you're going on to is a role that involves lots of public speaking. But I think actually in a way it's the smaller, more interpersonal work that we do with students in Cambridge that actually can be incredibly powerful, because it's much closer to leadership and advising, influencing, guiding. So a lot of those really subtle, sophisticated interpersonal skills that our teaching system really relies on, I think, are hugely transferable, particularly in kind of group settings, or where maybe as a researcher you might be supporting more junior researchers earlier in their career. And I'd really encourage everyone to be thinking in terms of both formal and informal experience. I do feel sometimes when I'm talking to postdocs, they worry that if they didn't have a title like lecturer or primary supervisor, that they're disqualified from talking about all the useful, helpful things they did. But it's just good interview practice, right? If you can or application practice, if you can tell a story about, there was this person struggling with this thing, I helped them in the following way, this is what we did, this is what it led to. That's actually really relevant to working in other sectors. That would be my first advice, I think.
Great, thank you. Liz, do you have anything to add?
I think one of the things I wanted to add, which is perhaps a more general point, is that the discussions that I have taken part in over the last couple of months around, specifically this issue of permeability in the academia industry space, but also some of the more general research culture discussions we've been having, have really started to acknowledge that you can't talk about career paths for researchers in this kind of singular way, and that arts, humanities and social sciences have very different structures, and we need to really recognise that. And I think the research culture discussion initially was, it wasn't really structured in that way, and I don't think we were acknowledging that there were some really quite fundamental differences between the way those different disciplines work that change how you have these discussions. So we had a discussion recently, which was organised by Universities UK, around the topic of precarity and fairness in academic careers, and there was a lot of discussion and acknowledgement in that meeting that career paths for people in the arts and humanities disciplines might be not as linear as they are for STEM disciplines, and have to take into account things like teaching and how that fits in, and how those kinds of contracts fit into the career pathway. So I think it's an emerging discussion, but I sense that over the next couple of years, people will really start to acknowledge that we need to think about that in a slightly different way, and hopefully that then generates more helpful guidance and support for people in those disciplines, because we start to really acknowledge how to do things differently for those spaces.
I'd really echo that, because I've actually been having, it's more sort of narrow in a sense, but I've been having conversations with people involved in, you know, the ESRC, the British Academy and Wellcome, where they want to talk about sort of leadership and career development specifically for humanities and social sciences researchers, and about the sort of like trying to redress that kind of imbalance I think that Liz is talking about. And I think that, you know, where you said it's a kind of emergent conversation, I think it feels the same when we're talking about thinking about where leadership fits within career development as well. And I see that as quite, it's very much of a piece with what you're describing.
Great, fantastic. Thanks to both of you for those excellent comments. We'll move on to the next question now, and it'll start with Liz, I think. How does research culture and permeability vary from country to country?
So this was something I don't think we covered in the main session. I'm really pleased that people have asked about it. So obviously research cultures differ even between research groups, let alone between countries. But one of the things that I think is very positive and encouraging is that the conversation around research culture and some of the big issues that we are discussing and thinking about trying to change are the same across lots of different countries. And there's a lot of activity on the European landscape driven by countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland, and perhaps some of the Scandinavian countries, to think about this with a recognition that research is a global endeavour. So if we are to change things for the system, we need to all work together. If you change, for example, the way we measure people in the UK, and then people want to go to another country and they're measured in a completely different way, it's very difficult to really change things. And there's a lot of collaboration as well. And I think that you know, our relationships with the European research landscape are always evolving, but in the research culture space, we are definitely having conversations and collaborating with our partners in these places, sharing ideas, sharing ways of working, and I think that's really positive. But it is quite focused in Europe and the UK, so I'm not seeing a lot of conversation. Well, if conversation is happening in the US, they're not talking to us about it necessarily so much. There are some conversations starting to happen in Australia and New Zealand, and we've started to have some conversations along those lines with partners, but it's definitely, I feel, quite a big movement in Europe. In terms of permeability, I think it's not a conversation. So the conversation in Europe is very focused around reward and recognition and research assessment. So they are very focused on how we assess research and researchers. And I don't know whether you both may have a view on this, but my sense is that perhaps the permeability in a lot of European countries is less of an issue than it is here, because of the way industry is set up, and the way that the careers in those areas have a slightly different value than they do in this country. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily a discussion that they see such a problem with as we have here. I do think one of the things which is very interesting about research culture discussions in Europe is that they aren't yet thinking about this arts and humanities divide. And one of the things that I had a really interesting discussion in the Netherlands with people about, they talk constantly about open science. And I said, do you not talk about open research? Because in the UK, we talk about open research because we recognise that, you know, there are challenges in other disciplines as well. And it's something to do with the translation of the word that they use for open science comes out directly as open science. And apparently everyone's fine with that. So I didn't talk to the arts and humanities researchers about that, but I just thought that's an interesting, their discussions are very, I think, very STEM focused in Europe.
Interesting. Steve, any thoughts?
To be honest, not really. I think I agree with what Liz has said. I mean, I think that, you know, it's not just the different structures around kind of industry that we see overseas, but also if you think about how different academia is structured, you know, in some countries, you know, researchers are seen as civil servants and they're effectively employed, but they're seen as employees of the state in a way that we're not in this country, however much the taxpayers' money might have worked its way through the different kind of phases and ended up in a lab. So there's that. And I think, you know, then there are those examples of countries like Germany, which have a fixed limit on the amount of time you can spend postdocing. So I think it does feel like it has to be taken on a kind of like country by country basis, to be really honest. And yeah, that interesting point about whether in some countries science would cover the arts and humanities or not. Yeah, I mean, I think I know Germany a little bit. I think it would. So, but it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't map across to the UK so neatly.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks to both of you. And just a quick reminder to those of you listening that, you know, Cambridge is a phenomenally international community, so tapping into your colleagues to find out a little bit about it is a great way if you're considering an international move, just to get more insight rather than the big overview. Don't forget about that. For our final question today, it focuses on salary differences. So the question is phrased as, regarding the salary differences, why does industry not consider postdoc years as R&D industry experience? And furthermore, is there any dialogue on this with the UK industry? So I will leave it to both of you to interpret bits of that as you see fit. Steve, can we start with you?
Yeah, I wonder if this is picking up on, I think, something I said in passing at some point in the previous discussion around, actually, I was really interested to discover that when you transition from academia into commercial R&D, at that transition point, the salaries are generally equal. Or there's much less disparity, except in certain key areas, you know, high demand areas. But that as you progress in commercial research, you usually what you'd expect to see is that somebody's earning potential increases much more quickly than it does in academia. I mean, I think I don't necessarily want to accept the premise of the question that commercial employers wouldn't consider postdoc years as R&D experience. I mean, this is every careers advisor's favorite answer to every question is it depends, but I think it does depend. It depends on how you present it. I think, you know, if somebody rocked up in an academic research group having worked in industry and they made no effort to think about translating their experience to an academic environment to show how their interests were aligned with what we care about and that they could contribute to the success of our research group, we would feel, but I think potentially a bit grumpy that they haven't kind of done that legwork to help us see why they would be an asset to our research group. So the same applies going the other way. If we're doing the work of showing, you know, we recognize it's a different environment. We recognize they work to different timescales with different funding pressures. They report in different ways to different stakeholders. So then it's about finding like what is the core kind of like relevant transferable experience and not treating every job in industry as if it's a cut and paste of the previous one, but really trying to get under the skin of what is it about that organization that they think makes them distinctive. That's how you get them to recognize the value of your experience. It's because you put it in language that they can understand. I think that would be my sort of, you know, old-fashioned kind of view, but I still think it's true. In terms of dialogue with industry, I do think that's probably at an early stage. I mean, it is part of what's going on. They, in UKRI, the government, stakeholders are having these conversations. But really, I mean, it's like Liz and I've been saying all the way along, we're at a tipping point. I think what we're talking about is that the coming generation is going to experience this change, and we're not there yet. But that's probably my answer.
Great, thank you. Liz?
I don't really have a great deal to add, actually. I think Steve has captured it really well. I mean, I think at a very basic level, why does industry not consider postdoc years as R&D industry experience? Well, it's not R&D industry experience, it's a postdoc. And I think those are those are two different career options. And I think exactly what Steve was saying, there are similarities, but there are also substantial differences in the way that you might work as an individual postdoc working on a project in a research group versus as a researcher in an industrial lab, where you might be working across multiple projects, multiple programs, in different teams and in completely different ways. And I think that's really the nub of it. It's that they're not absolutely equivalent experiences, and you can certainly develop yourself to make them as equivalent as possible. And it's very important, as we've discussed, to communicate where those similarities are. So I think you have to appreciate that you are talking about two different things, really.
Can I put in a plug for engaging with the Postdoc Academy and looking at the entrepreneurial mindset course and thinking about the Postdocs to Innovators Network and some of the other provision that the Postdoc Academy helps to organise? Is if you're wanting to kind of dip a toe into thinking about, sorry, I understand there's loads of stuff available in Cambridge. I'm not saying we're the only ones, but if you are looking for something, then get in touch with the Postdoc Academy, and we can link you up with Katja Smith-Letier, and she can guide you to what we offer. So, and sorry, Sonali, I know the career service offers lots as well.
Absolutely, no,
Didn't want to
but
miss a trick, I thought I'd get in trouble.
It is a network, and we all provide different types of support. So please, all of you, do reach out to PDA, to the career service, and to HR as well. Yeah. Any final thoughts from either of you? And no is an okay answer. All right. Well, thank you both very much for your time, and thank you all for listening.